The 1980s saw a huge advancement in technology, and that went by cars as well, from the race to 200 miles per hour to the very first hot hatches. These are the iconic cars of the 80s. Hello friends, my name is the Real Emile, and welcome to this week's episode of Forza Top Gear Laps, where once again we're taking a look at some more iconic cars, this time from the 80s. First up, we have the BMW M1, 277 horsepower, 2,866 pounds of weight. The BMW M1 is widely regarded as one of the first everyday supercars ever made. BMW tried to make a supercar which could be used for everyday tasks, and well, with the M1, they kind of succeeded. So, what is the M1 actually like to drive? Well, it's quite nice to drive actually. It's a little bit on the slidey side. Again, that could be just due to the rain. I have driven this thing in the dry, and I can confirm it is a little bit slidey on there, so maybe the wet does enhance that a bit. But nevertheless, it is still a pretty darn nice car to drive actually. 277 horsepower over the past few weeks, that is certainly a decent figure. It's not the most powerful car here today, not by a long shot. But compared to some of the cars that we've had around in recent weeks, that is quite a lot of power. So straight line speed, it's pretty decent in a straight line actually. I guess that aerodynamic shape also really helps it along, because this thing is, well, very wedgy, which is pretty cool. Also has pop-up headlights, so it automatically gets 20 more coolness points, as we all know. So yeah, M1 is not a bad vehicle to drive by any stretch of the imagination, and yeah, I enjoyed my time with the M1. Compared to modern day supercars, it isn't the quickest. 277 horsepower isn't a lot compared to modern supercars, but for back in the day, it was certainly enough. Next up, we have a Porsche 911 Turbo 3.3, 296 horsepower, 2,866 pounds of weight. This weighs exactly the same as the BMW M1 you just saw go around. However, this thing does have a little bit more power. However, this car is actually quite far away from what the BMW M1 is. The M1 is a mid-engined rear-drive supercar. The Turbo is a rear-engined rear-drive sports car. And as such, because it's rear engine, this thing likes to slide. All of the weight is over the rear end, as you would probably imagine, because of course this is a rear engine rear wheel drive car. There's not a lot of weight in the front, and that does mean that it can be slidey. Now, luckily it isn't power enough to be floaty. Now, occasionally with rear engine rear drive cars, they will be very, very floaty in the way they drive, and the 911 isn't that. It is a little bit soft suspension-wise. Again, this is sort of a road sports car, and, you know, it's not that old, but it is still relatively old, so the suspension technology isn't quite as advanced as what we had today, so it isn't quite as stiff as you'd probably expect it to be, but it's still reasonably okay. And that soft suspension really does stop the front end lifting off as much as well, which is quite nice. Overall, 911 Turbo is an okay car. I would still personally take the M1 over the 911 Turbo. I just think it's the better car of the two to drive. But the Turbo certainly isn't a bad vehicle. Next up, we have an Audi Quattro, a rallying legend, 306 horsepower, 2,807 pounds of weight. Ironically, this car has more power than the M1 and the 911 Turbo, which I was not expecting. Admittedly, this is the Sport Quattro, but you still would not expect this thing to have that much power. Speaking of having that much power, that actually means it's on par with today's modern Subaru WRX STI. I believe that has 305 horsepower, so yeah, it's very much on par with the modern rally cars today, despite being made in 1983. However, does it drive like something from 1983? Not really, no. It's a pretty darn nice car to drive. It is quick. This thing is surprisingly quick. As far as sort of modern day rally cars go, I would assume this thing is quicker in a straight line than most of them, you know, your Evos and your Imprezas. This thing is pretty goddamn quick. I'm still really looking forward to when we're gonna put the Imprezas and the Evos against the Quattro, because I'm actually really curious to see how they fare against this and indeed other Group B rally cars of its era. There were, on the shortlist for this one, I did want to stick a Group B rally car in here. I was originally going to go with the 205 T16 and the Ford RS200, but in the end I went with the Quattro, because of course the Quattro is known for being the car that sort of revolutionised rallying, started making four-wheel drive a necessity, pretty much, within its class. Anyways, next up we have something which has the lowest amount of power here today. The Volkswagen Rabbit GTI has a mighty 90 horsepower. Yeah, £2,100 though does mean that it's the lightest vehicle here today. So the Rabbit is what we would call a Mark 1 Golf. This is the GTI model, and this car is known for basically being the one that sort of brought hot hatches to the attention of most people. This is the car which popularised hot hatchbacks. It isn't the first, contrary to popular belief. There was a few others. There was the Vauxhall Chevette, I believe, had a sort of special edition, and there was also the Fiesta XR2i. And a Talbot Sunbeam something or other, Lotus Sunbeam. Yeah, they are the first hot hatches. This isn't the first hot hatch, however, it is one of the first, and it's definitely the one that sort of popularised these things. Anyways, what is the Rabbit like to drive? Well, as you can probably tell by going around here, it is slow. This thing is, in all likelihood, probably slower than the Cooper S that we had around a couple of weeks ago. Other than that though, it is decent enough to drive. It does have a bit of one tyre fire going. The differential on this car does like to let the loose wheel sort of spin a bit, which can be a little bit irritating. Again, on rain you don't really get affected by it as much as you would on sort of normal dry land. It's a fun car to drive. This is a decent fun car to drive. It's just very, very chuckable through the corners. You can throw this thing into corners and it will comply. It very much reminds me of the Cooper S that we had go around a couple of weeks ago. Out of the two, I would probably go with the Cooper S. I think you can take a bit more corner speed than the Cooper, and it's a little bit sort of quicker in a straight line, but nevertheless the Rabbit was a good car. Next up we have the Buick Regal Grand National, 300 horsepower, 3,545 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest car here today, unsurprisingly of course. So the Regal Grand National is sort of one of the first American cars that used turbocharging technology and really sort of started making turbo cars cool, because before then they weren't quite as cool. But with the Grand National, of course, turbocharging became a major thing and Americans really appreciated turbocharging. Anyways, what is the GNX like to drive? Well, it's very much like a muscle car. It's tricky to drive, this one. The first thing I noticed is it has a very, very high sort of riding position in the actual interior view, which is a little bit strange. It really feels like you're driving an SUV with this thing. It will try and slide a lot, this thing. It really feels like you're driving on ice with the Regal. Like, it doesn't feel like there's all that much grip in it. So it will slide pretty much everywhere. It is a tricky car to drive. It is a little bit of fun, I will admit. Admittedly, fun cars aren't quick cars, and that's something you got to remember on the Top Gear track. If I say a car's fun to drive, chances are it usually isn't very quick, but I enjoyed driving it. And with the Regal, I enjoyed myself. I do like the Regal Grand National, so yeah, that always helps as well. Next up, we have a Ferrari F40, the first production car to ever go past 200 miles per hour. 478 horsepower means this is the most powerful vehicle here today on 2,980 pounds of weight. Certainly isn't a lot. So for the first time in a few weeks, or for the first time since the premiere in fact, the F40 really does stand a chance of contending for the top of our leaderboard. Our current leader is a Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera, which went round in 121.838, I believe. So yeah, what does the Ferrari have working against it? Well, the Gallardo was four-wheel drive, it had a lot more power as well. However, the F40 is a lot lighter, and this is a lot nicer to drive. I've spoke about how excellent the Ferrari F40 and the F50 are to drive, and that still holds up even in the rain. The F40 is an absolute superb handling vehicle. This thing is super, super nice to drive. Personally, I do prefer the F50 when it comes to its handling characteristics, but the F40 is definitely a very, very good car to drive. Yeah, it's pretty much perfect, at least for me, as far as I'm concerned. It also helps that the F40 is a very good looking car, and it's a very, very cool car indeed. I do really like the F40, so let's see if it'll actually beat the Gallardo towards the end of the show. Next up we have a BMW M5. This is the E28. 282 horsepower, 3,230 pounds of weight. If that power figure sounds familiar to you, then that's because this thing uses the same engine that the M1 used, so that's pretty interesting. The M5 was sort of one of the first ever super saloons, And with 282 horsepower, I mean, that's still pretty darn good, especially by today's standards. Admittedly, you know, when you compare it to super saloons of today, they're producing 500, 600 horsepower, it isn't great. However, you know, compared to modern road cars, that's still pretty goddamn good. And the weight isn't too bad either. 3,230 pounds really isn't a lot for this sort of saloon. Anyways, what is the M5 like to drive? Well, just like the M1, it does like to slide. It likes to slide a bit more than the M1 does, though. I would sort of put this between the M1 and the Regal in terms of sliding. Admittedly, it isn't quite as uncontrollable as the Regal is. When that starts losing grip, it doesn't feel like you're driving on ice either in the M5, which is always a good thing. It's okay-ish. It's alright, is really all I can say about the M5. As far as building this thing up to be a race car, I can imagine it's very good at that. It's got a very, very nice engine in it as well. I really like the engine in sort of the M1 and the M5. It's a pretty nice, smooth engine. Yeah, the M5 isn't a bad car by any stretch of the imagination. Personally, for me, out of all the M5s, this isn't the one I'd pick, but it certainly isn't bad. And finally, today we have a Toyota MR2 Supercharged, the AW11. 145 horsepower, 2,620 pounds of weight. Now, the MR2 Supercharged, I was actually driving this one a couple of days ago. I ended up making a D-Class track car out of this, and I found it to be absolutely incredible to drive. So I was kind of wondering what the MR2 would be like stock. And well, on my notes here, I have this pretty much summed up correctly. This car is a lot like driving a budget McLaren F1. Hear me out. This thing really does drive like a McLaren F1, just a lot less of a McLaren F1. You know, McLaren F1 has 600 horsepower. It's a supercar, you know. The MR2 is not a supercar. However, in the handling characteristics, it definitely feels like an F1. If you put enough power into this thing, I can imagine it would drive basically exactly like a McLaren F1 would, which is kind of strange when you think about it. But yeah. Luckily, in case you are curious, the McLaren F1 is a good driving car. I do like the way the McLaren F1 drives. I will say on this one, the rear end will occasionally rear its head a bit. It doesn't usually though, that's the thing. It's still a very, very grippy car. It's a very nice car to drive. Interestingly enough, this is the first ever MR2 we've ever had go around the track on Forza Top Gear laps in all of the seasons, which is a little bit strange when you think about it, considering the MR2 is one of my more favourites of the sort of sports cars of the 80s and 90s. I did enjoy my time with the AW11 actually. I do like this car, and I desperately recommend you try and build that up as a race car, because it's really, really good. Anyways, onto the times, and the F40 beats the Gallardo with a 121.484. That's our new leader, that's the one to beat. Moving down the board, the BMW M1 goes into 9th with a 130.002. Audi Quattro goes into 10th with a 130.318. The Porsche 911 Turbo goes into 11th with a 130.818. So what does that all mean? Well, you can't see it on the screen at the moment, but that does mean the 911 Turbo, Quattro and M1 did all beat a Lamborghini Miura, which is kind of good. And moving down the board, the M5 goes into 14th with a 132.387, just fractionally off of an R32 Golf. The Buick Regal is not that far behind at all in 15th with a 132.421. That's a pretty goddamn good lap time for the Regal, especially considering that car wasn't the easiest to drive. In 19th, we find the Toyota MR2 Supercharged with 135.956, just beating out the Vauxhall Corsa, which does make me happy because I much prefer the MR2 to the Corsa. And finally today, our new slowest car, in the same episode that we got our new fastest car. The Volkswagen Rabbit GTI goes into 30th with a 145.014, just tiny little bit off the Mini Cooper S. Personally, I do prefer the Cooper S to drive, so yeah, not too surprised about that. Anyways, friends, that is it for this episode of the Forza Top Gear Laps. I do hope you've joined us. Next time we'll be taking a look at the iconic cars from the early 90s, so join me for that. Anyways, friends, as always, if you have any suggestions you'd like to, or any cars that you'd like to see go around the track, or any particular themes you'd like to see, let me know in the comment section below and I'll get back to you on that. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name has been the Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.